Blood dried beneath the fingernails of a man who swore he would never care about anything again. Dust settled over worn leather cuts and roaring engines outside. But the silence inside the roadside diner was heavier than any Harley exhaust. A 7-year-old boy, dragging a heavy steel brace on his right leg, approached a table surrounded by patched members of the Hells Angels. Bypassing terrifying men with switchblades and scarred knuckles, the boy looked directly at the deadliest one of all. What happened next tore apart a 30-year secret, proving some ghosts don't haunt graveyards, they sit in diners asking for a seat. The Mojave Desert heat radiated off the asphalt in shimmering waves, baking the exterior of Rusty's diner into a peeling, sun-bleached husk. Inside, the air conditioner rattled violently, losing its daily war against the California summer. Jackson Miller sat in the corner booth, his broad back pressed against the cracked red vinyl. At 52, Jackson was a mountain of a man, his arms a canvas of faded ink, scars, and the unmistakable death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. He wasn't just a member, he was the sergeant at arms for the Oakland chapter, a man whose reputation was paved with broken teeth and unwavering loyalty. Today, however, he was just tired. Flanking him in the booth were Silas and Big Jim, two brothers of the road who had ridden down the I-15 with him to handle a supply dispute near Barstow. They were nursing black coffees and picking at greasy hash browns. The diner was sparse. A couple of weary truckers occupied the counter, and a terrified elderly couple huddled in a booth near the door, desperately trying not to make eye contact with the 3 heavily tattooed bikers dominating the back of the room. The bell above the diner door chimed a cheerful, tinny sound completely at odds with the suffocating atmosphere. Jackson didn't look up from his coffee mug. He didn't need to. He heard the heavy, rhythmic clack-drag of metal on linoleum. It was an uneven gait, slow and labored. Clack, drag, clack, drag. Got astray. Silas muttered around the unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. Jackson slowly lifted his eyes. Walking down the center aisle of the diner was a small boy. He couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. His clothes were filthy, a t-shirt that might have once been white, now stained with motor oil and dirt, and corduroy pants that were frayed at the hems. But it was the boy's right leg that drew the eye. It was encased in a heavy, archaic metal brace, the kind that looked like it belonged in a polio ward from the 1950s, not the modern era. The boy's face was smeared with grime, his blonde hair matted to his forehead with sweat, but his eyes, piercing, icy blue, were locked dead onto Jackson. The truckers at the counter fell silent. The elderly couple stopped chewing. The only sound was the hum of the broken air conditioner and the relentless clack-drag of the boy's approach. Silas chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Kid's got a death wish, walking towards this table. Leave it be, Jackson growled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. The boys stopped right at the edge of their table. Up close, Jackson could see the dark purple circles under the child's eyes, the hollows of his cheeks. This wasn't just a kid who had been playing in the dirt. This was a kid who was starving, who was running. Big Jim leaned forward, casting a massive shadow over the boy. You lost, little man? Best go find your mama. This ain't the playground. The boy didn't flinch at Jim's booming voice. He didn't look at Jim at all. He kept his gaze fixed on Jackson. He reached out a small, trembling hand and gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Can I sit with you? The boy asked. His voice was a rasp, parched and desperate, yet remarkably steady. Silas let out a bark of laughter. Well, I'll be damned. Kid wants to ride with the angels. Jackson raised a massive hand, instantly silencing Silas. He stared down at the boy. Jackson had spent decades intimidating men twice his size. He had stared down rival club presidents, corrupt vice cops, and men with shotguns. But this tiny, broken boy was looking back at him with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Jackson's neck stand up. Why do you want to sit here, kid? Jackson asked, keeping his tone neutral. Plenty of empty booths. Because, the boy said, his grip tightening on the table, they won't look for me here. And, you're the one she said to find. The diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jackson's posture shifted, his muscles tensing beneath his leather cut. Who is she? Jackson asked softly. The boy swayed slightly, exhaustion finally taking its toll. My mom. She said, look for the screaming bird. The boy pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger directly at Jackson's throat. Right over his Adam's apple, barely visible above the collar of his shirt, was a faded, 30-year-old tattoo of an eagle. Mid-shriek a tattoo. Jackson had gotten in a drunken stupor in Tijuana, one he had never shown to anyone but his closest confidants. Jackson's blood ran cold. He slid over on the vinyl seat, patting the space next to him. Sit down, kid, Jackson commanded. The boy didn't need to be told twice. He practically collapsed onto the red vinyl, his metal brace clanking against the table leg. Silas and Big Jim exchanged bewildered glances, but neither dared question their sergeant-at-arms. When Jackson Miller made a call, the chapter followed. "Hey, Brenda." Jackson barked across the diner. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in a pink uniform, jumped. "Bring the kid a cheeseburger, double patty, fries, and a large chocolate shake. Pronto." "Yes, sir, Mr. Miller," Brenda stammered, rushing toward the kitchen. Jackson turned his attention back to the boy, who was now staring at the tabletop, his small chest heaving as he caught his breath. Up close, the reality of the child's condition was far worse than Jackson had initially thought. Beneath the grime on the boy's neck, Jackson spotted the unmistakable yellow-green fading of a bruise, shaped like a handprint. Jackson felt a familiar, dangerous anger ignite in his chest. He lived outside the law. He did things polite, society condemned. But the Hells Angels had a strict, unbreakable code when it came to women and children. "What's your name, boy?" Jackson asked, his voice softer now, almost a rumble. "Leo," the boy whispered. "Leo. Good, strong name. I'm Jackson. This ugly mug is Silas, and the mountain over there is Jim." Leo gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to the two massive bikers. Big Jim, whose beard was braided with silver rings, actually offered the kid a gentle, gap-toothed smile. "You said your mom told you to find me." Jackson pressed gently. "How does your mom know about my tattoo, Leo?" Leo hesitated. He reached into the pocket of his frayed corduroys. His small hand was shaking violently. "She didn't know you. She gave me this. Said if I ever got away, to find the men in the leather vests, look for the big one with the bird on his neck, and give him this." Leo pulled his hand from his pocket and placed something on the table. It slid across the formica and clinked against Jackson's coffee mug. Jackson stared at the object. The diner around him faded away. The rattling air conditioner, the smell of grease, the presence of Silas and Jim, it all vanished into a tunnel of blinding, deafening white noise. It was a heavy, silver Zippo lighter. It was deeply tarnished, covered in scratches and dents, but the engraving on the front was undeniable. It was the Hells Angels' death's head, but modified. Beneath the skull, instead of the standard MC, there were two crossed scythes, and the letters A.M. Jesus Christ. Silas breathed, leaning in to look at the lighter. "Jax, is that?" "Shut up, Silas," Jackson said, his voice trembling for the first time in 20 years. He reached out and picked up the lighter. It felt impossibly heavy. It was a custom piece, one of only 2 ever made. Jackson had the exact match sitting in a locked safe beneath the floorboards of his house in Oakland. He had forged them himself, 32 years ago, in a metal shop class. One for him, one for his younger brother, Arthur Miller. Arthur, the golden boy. The brother who had joined the club, ridden by Jackson's side, and then betrayed them all. Arthur had allegedly stolen club funds and vanished into the night with a rival cartel's money, sparking a blood feud that cost 3 angels their lives. The club had voted on it. Arthur was marked for death, but before the Hells Angels could find him, the cartel had. The police had pulled Arthur's burnt, unidentifiable remains from a torched Cadillac in the Nevada desert a decade ago. The only identifier had been his dental records, or so they thought. Jackson looked from the lighter to the boy, the ice-blue eyes, the blonde hair. "Leo," Jackson said, struggling to draw breath. "What is your mother's name?" "Sarah," Leo replied softly. "And your father?" Leo flinched, shrinking back into the booth. The reaction was visceral, born of deep-seated terror. I don't know his real name. Mom called him Artie. But the other men, the scary men, they call him the Ghost." Big Jim slammed his massive fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "Artie. Arthur. He's alive, Jax. That son of a bitch faked his death and left us to bleed." Jackson didn't speak. He couldn't. His brother, the traitor, was alive. And this crippled, starving boy sitting next to him was his blood, his nephew. Brenda rushed over, practically slamming the plate of food and the milkshake onto the table before retreating to the safety of the counter. "Eat," Jackson commanded Leo, pushing the plate forward. Leo didn't need further encouragement. He grabbed the burger with both hands and tore into it with a ferocity that was heartbreaking to watch. He ate like an animal that expected the food to be snatched away at any second. "Jax," Silas murmured, leaning in close so the kid wouldn't hear. "If Arthur is alive, and he's tied up with the cartel, the club's going to demand his head. You know the rules. He's excommunicated, marked." "I know the damn rules, Silas," Jackson hissed. "But look at the kid. Arthur is running with the Ghosts, and his kid is out here starving with handprints on his neck." Someone is hunting them. You said they wouldn't look for you here, Leo, Jackson said, turning back to the boy, who was now taking massive gulps of the chocolate shake. Who are they? Leo wiped his mouth with the back of his dirty sleeve. The men in the black trucks. They took Mom 2 days ago. They locked me in a closet at the motel, but I got the window open. I walked all night. Mom said if things went bad, find the angels. A cold realization washed over the table. If a cartel hit squad was looking for Arthur's family, and Leo had walked here on a crippled leg from a nearby motel, they were out of time. Jim, get on the horn to Oakland, Jackson ordered, his voice shifting from shocked uncle to tactical commander. Tell the president we have a code red, priority 1. Tell him we found a ghost. Silas, go check the bikes. Make sure we're fueled and ready to burn rubber. Jax, Jim hesitated. If I call this in, the club is going to want Arthur dead, and they ain't gonna care much for his spawn, either. The blood feud, I am the sergeant at arms. Jackson roared, his voice echoing off the diner walls, making the truckers jump. This boy is under my protection. You tell the president that if anyone touches a hair on this kid's head, they deal with me. Now make the call. Jim nodded, pulling out his cell phone and stepping toward the back hallway of the diner. Silas slipped out the front door, his hand resting casually over the bulge of the .45 caliber pistol tucked into his waistband. Jackson looked at Leo. The boy had stopped eating. He was staring at the window, his blue eyes wide with a fresh, paralyzing terror. Jackson followed the boy's gaze. Pulling into the dusty parking lot of Rusty's diner were 2 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans. They didn't park in the marked spaces. They boxed in the Hells Angels motorcycles, cutting off their escape route. The dark tinted windows rolled down, revealing shadows moving inside. Are those the men, Leo? Jackson asked, his voice deathly calm. Leo nodded slowly, shrinking down until he was barely visible over the edge of the table. They have guns. Big ones. Jackson reached under his leather cut and unholstered his own weapon, resting it flat against his thigh under the table. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline mask the exhaustion in his bones. He had spent 30 years fighting for a patch, for a brotherhood that demanded blood and absolute loyalty. He had mourned a brother he thought was dead, only to discover a betrayal deeper than he could have ever imagined. But as he looked at the terrified boy with the metal brace on his leg, a boy who carried Jackson's blood, the rules of the club suddenly meant nothing. The doors of the Suburbans opened. 4 men stepped out into the blinding Mojave sun. They wore tactical gear, not gang colors. These weren't street thugs. They were highly paid professionals. Mercenaries. The cartel had sent their best to clean up Arthur's mess. Silas was outside, standing calmly by the bikes, completely outnumbered. Leo, Jackson said, not taking his eyes off the men outside. I need you to listen to me very carefully. You see the kitchen doors over there? Yes, Leo whispered. When I tell you to move, I want you to run as fast as that leg will let you into the kitchen. You find Brenda, the lady who brought you the burger. You tell her to lock you in the walk-in freezer and not to open it until she hears my voice. Do you understand? Are you going to shoot them? Leo asked. There was no judgment in the boy's voice, only a hardened acceptance of violence that a 7-year-old should never possess. I'm going to make sure you finish that milkshake, Jackson said, a grim smile touching the corner of his lips. The diner door chimed its cheerful, tinny tune. 2 of the mercenaries stepped inside. The lead man was tall, with a military buzz cut and eyes like dead black stones. He carried a suppressed submachine gun on a tactical sling, making no effort to hide it. The truckers at the counter threw their hands over their heads and hit the floor. The elderly couple screamed. We're looking for a boy, the lead merc announced, his voice carrying easily over the rattling AC. Blonde hair, shitty leg. Hand him over, and nobody else has to die today. Jackson stood up slowly. He was 6'4" and built like a brick wall. The leather cut with the Hells Angels insignia creaked as he moved, placing himself squarely between the mercenaries and the booth where Leo was hiding. Diners closed. Boys, Jackson growled, stepping into the aisle. You best turn around and get back in your soccer mom vans before I get offended. The mercenary sneered. A biker. How quaint. Look, old man, this doesn't concern your little club. The kid belongs to Victoriano. His father stole from us, and the bloodline pays the debt. Move aside. You clearly don't know who the hell you're talking to, Jackson said, his hand tightening on the grip of the pistol at his side. I know you're Jackson Miller, the mercenary said smoothly. I know your brother Arthur is a rat, and I know that if you don't step aside, we're going to paint this diner with your brains. Jackson chuckled, a dark, dangerous sound. He glanced back toward the kitchen. Jim was standing in the doorway, a massive shotgun resting on his hip. Outside the window, Jackson could see Silas had drawn his weapon and was flanking the two men still by the Suburbans. "You see, that's the problem with you cartel boys," Jackson said, raising his gun. "You think you own the violence, but you're standing in my church." Jackson didn't wait for a response. He didn't offer a dramatic countdown. "Leo, run," Jackson roared. The boy scrambled from the booth, the heavy metal brace clacking furiously against the linoleum as he bolted for the kitchen. The mercenary raised his submachine gun. Jackson fired first. The deafening crack of Jackson's .45 caliber pistol shattered the stifling tension of the diner. He didn't aim for the mercenary's chest, knowing full well these cartel hitmen wore level 3 Kevlar beneath their tactical rigs. Jackson aimed high. The heavy slug caught the lead mercenary right under the jawline, a spray of crimson mist erupting as the man's head snapped back with bone-crunching force. The submachine gun in his hands discharged wildly into the ceiling, raining acoustic tiles and plaster dust over the terrified truckers huddled on the linoleum. Before the first mercenary even hit the floor, the second man lunged sideways, diving behind the reinforced steel of the diner's counter. He blind-fired a burst of automatic fire toward Jackson's booth. Jackson dropped heavily to his knees, the red vinyl of the booth shredding into a cloud of synthetic foam above his head as 9mm rounds chewed through the furniture. The smell of cordite instantly overpowered the scent of burnt coffee and grease. From the kitchen doorway, Big Jim roared like a wounded bear. He stepped completely into the open, ignoring the crossfire, and leveled his sawed-off, 1-2 gauge shotgun. The boom was catastrophic in the enclosed space. A cloud of double-aught buckshot tore through the wooden facade of the front counter, splintering it into 1,000 lethal toothpicks. The mercenary hiding behind it let out a sharp, choked gasp as the wood and lead found their mark. Outside, the parking lot had erupted into its own war zone. Silas had used the momentary distraction of the indoor gunfire to make his move. Jackson could hear the rhythmic, methodical pop-pop of Silas's weapon, followed by the deeper, heavier answering fire of an assault rifle. "Jim, the door," Jackson shouted over the ringing in his ears, staying low as he scrambled over the debris of his shattered booth. Jim pumped the shotgun, ejecting a smoking red shell, and kicked the front door of the diner open, shattering the remaining glass. He laid down a suppressing field of fire toward the black Suburbans. Jackson ignored the dead mercenary bleeding out near the entrance and sprinted toward the kitchen. He kicked the swinging doors open, his pistol raised. The kitchen was a chaotic mess of spilled soup, scattered pans, and hissing fryers. In the back corner, near the massive stainless steel door of the walk-in freezer, Brenda the waitress was curled into a tight ball, sobbing hysterically with her hands clamped over her ears. "Brenda," Jackson barked, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had spent 3 decades giving orders in the underworld. "Is he inside?" The woman could only nod, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Jackson stepped over to the heavy metal handle and yanked the freezer door open. The blast of sub-zero air hit his sweat-drenched face. In the dim, frosty light, huddled between boxes of frozen hamburger patties and industrial bags of French fries, was Leo. The boy had his arms wrapped tightly around his braced leg, shivering violently, but his jaw was set. He wasn't crying. "Come here, kid," Jackson said, reaching out a massive, tattooed hand. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jackson's hand and let the giant biker pull him out of the freezing dark. "Are the bad men dead?" Leo asked, his teeth chattering. "The ones in here are," Jackson replied grimly. He hoisted the boy up, effortlessly carrying Leo's slight weight under his left arm while keeping his pistol raised in his right. "We're leaving." Jackson carried Leo back out into the main dining area. Jim was reloading his shotgun, keeping a watchful eye on the parking lot. The elderly couple under the window was miraculously unharmed, though the man was clutching his chest in terror. "Silas!" Jackson roared out the shattered front window. "Clear!" came the raspy shout from the dusty lot. Jackson and Jim moved out into the blinding Mojave sunlight. The heat hit them like a physical wall after the icy kitchen. 2 more mercenaries lay dead in the dirt near the rear Suburban. Silas was bleeding from a superficial graze on his left bicep, but he was already moving toward his Harley, trying to kickstart it. "Leave the bikes, Silas," Jackson ordered, tossing Leo into the back seat of the nearest running Suburban. The engine was still purring smoothly, the air conditioning blasting. Silas stopped, looking at his customized knucklehead with utter heartbreak. "Jax, you gotta be kidding me. I ain't leaving my iron for the cops. The cops are going to be swarming this place in 5 minutes," Jackson snapped, sliding into the driver's seat of the blood-spattered cartel vehicle. "If they run our plates, the club gets tied to this. If they find the kid, the state takes him. and the cartel kills him in foster care. We disappear. Now get in the damn truck. Jim squeezed his massive frame into the passenger seat, keeping his shotgun resting on his knees. Silas, muttering a string of violent curses, abandoned his beloved motorcycle and climbed into the back next to Leo. Jackson threw the heavy SUV into reverse, the tires screaming against the asphalt as he backed out of the lot. He didn't head toward the interstate. Instead, he spun the wheel hard, taking the Suburban off the pavement and straight down a rugged dirt access road that cut deep into the unforgiving, scrub-brush wilderness of the Mojave. Dust billowed behind them in a massive, obscuring cloud, swallowing Rusty's diner and the carnage they had left behind. For the first 20 miles, no one spoke. The only sounds in the cab of the stolen Suburban were the hum of the tires over the rutted dirt road, the forceful blast of the AC, and Silas tearing a strip of fabric from his shirt to wrap his bleeding arm. Jackson drove with a cold, mechanical precision. His mind was a tempest of conflicting loyalties and terrifying revelations. For 10 years, he had lived with the shame of his brother's betrayal. Arthur had been a patched member of the Hells Angels, a brother not just by blood but by the sacred oath of the club. When the club's treasury was emptied and 3 members were found dead, alongside a missing shipment of Victoriano cartel armaments, all fingers pointed to Arthur. He had vanished the same night. The club voted unanimously. Arthur was excommunicated, marked for death. Jackson, bound by his oath as sergeant-at-arms, had been forced to cast a vote against his own flesh and blood. He had mourned the brother he loved, hated the traitor he had become, and eventually accepted the fiery car crash that had supposedly taken Arthur's life. But looking in the rearview mirror at the bruised, exhausted face of the 7-year-old boy in the back seat, the neatly arranged puzzle of Jackson's life was violently scattered. "You doing okay back there, kid?" Silas asked, his voice rough but lacking its usual biting edge. He finished tying off his makeshift bandage and looked at Leo. Leo was staring out the tinted window at the passing Joshua trees, his small hands clutching the silver Zippo lighter in his lap. "I'm okay," he whispered. "Is my dad really your brother?" Jackson gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah, Leo, he is. Or, he was. We haven't seen your dad in a very long time. He talked about you," Leo said softly, turning his icy blue gaze to the back of Jackson's head. "He told me stories. About when you guys were kids in Oakland, how you taught him how to fix engines, how you both got those matching lighters." Jackson felt a lump form in his throat, thick and suffocating. He swallowed hard. "Where is your dad, Leo? Why did your mom send you to me instead of him?" Leo looked down at his heavy metal leg brace. He traced the scuffed steel joints with a dirty finger. "Dad's gone. He left a long time ago. Mom said he had to go into the dark to keep us in the light. But the men in the trucks, they found us anyway. They broke into the house in Phoenix. They dragged Mom out by her hair." The boy's voice finally cracked, a single tear cutting a clean streak through the grime on his cheek. "She screamed at me to run, to use the emergency money, and get on a bus to Barstow, to find the screaming bird." Big Jim shifted in the passenger seat, his leather cut creaking heavily. He looked at Jackson, his expression grim. "Jax, if Arthur is alive, and he's been hiding in Phoenix this whole time, the club is going to lose its collective mind. You know what Dutch is going to say." "Dutch is a paranoid old fool," Jackson growled, referring to Dutch Higgins, the current president of the Oakland chapter. Dutch had been the one driving the witch hunt against Arthur 10 years ago. He cares more about his alliances with the prison gangs than he does about the Brotherhood. "Maybe so," Jim replied, lowering his voice so Leo wouldn't hear. "But Dutch has the gavel. If he finds out we rescued Arthur's kid, he'll say we're harboring a traitor's blood. He'll put a green light on all 3 of us. We'll be hunted by the Angels and the cartel. Jax, we're riding straight into a meat grinder." "I don't care," Jackson said, his voice flat and absolute. "Look at him, Jim. He's a crippled kid. He's my nephew. I let Arthur down 10 years ago because I chose the patch over my own blood. I'm not making that mistake again." Silas leaned forward between the 2 front seats. "So what's the play, boss? We can't go back to the clubhouse. We can't go to our homes. These cartel guys are tracing Arthur's bloodline. They won't stop at a diner shootout. We go to Cotton's place," Jackson said, steering the Suburban onto a hidden, barely visible goat trail that wound deeper into the barren foothills. "Cotton?" Jim asked, raising an eyebrow. "The crazy old tunnel rat? He hasn't spoken to a soul in 5 years. Last I heard, he had the perimeter of his compound rigged with tripwires and claymores. He owes me his life," Jackson said, "and his property is completely off the grid. No cell service, no satellite footprint. We lay low, patch up Silas, and figure out exactly what the hell my brother stole from the Victoriano cartel. that has them hunting a 7-year-old boy a decade later. The sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the Mojave sky in bruised shades of purple and violent orange. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the stolen cartel vehicle as it descended into a desolate, rocky basin. In the back seat, Leo finally succumbed to his exhaustion. He curled up against the door, his heavy brace resting awkwardly on the leather seats, the silver Zippo lighter still clutched tightly against his chest. Jackson watched him in the mirror, an overwhelming sense of protective fury settling into his bones. The Hells Angels were his life, his identity, his religion. But as he looked at the sleeping boy, Jackson Miller knew he was ready to burn his own church to the ground. Cotton's compound looked less like a safe house and more like a junkyard that had survived a nuclear blast. Nestled deep in a dry wash, invisible from any main road, the property consisted of 3 dilapidated single-wide trailers surrounded by a maze of rusted shipping containers, cannibalized vehicle chassis, and towering stacks of old tires. As Jackson killed the engine of the Suburban, the suffocating silence of the desert night washed over them, broken only by the sharp, metallic click of a rifle bolt being pulled back. From the shadows of the central trailer, a figure emerged. He was shockingly thin, wearing faded military fatigues and a boonie hat. A thick, untamed white beard covered most of his face, but his eyes were sharp and clear behind wire-rimmed glasses. He held a customized M14 rifle leveled perfectly at Jackson's chest. "You're driving the wrong kind of truck, Jax," Cotton rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across asphalt. Jackson stepped out of the vehicle slowly, keeping his hands away from his sides. "Had a change of transportation. Cotton. Needs must." Cotton's eyes darted to Jim and Silas as they emerged, then zeroed in on the back door as Jackson opened it and gently lifted the sleeping Leo out. The old Vietnam veteran lowered his rifle, his hard expression softening just a fraction. "Brought a stray," Cotton noted. "My nephew," Jackson said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "We need a hole to hide in, old man. Heat is severe. Victoriano cartel, and likely the club by tomorrow morning." Cotton let out a low whistle. "You always did know how to throw a party, Jax. Get inside. I'll sweep the tracks and camouflage the truck." Inside the main trailer, the air smelled of stale tobacco, gun oil, and old paper. The walls were lined with ham radios, scanners, and military surplus gear. Jackson laid Leo down on a worn, olive-drab canvas cot in the corner. The boy stirred, groaning as Jackson began to carefully unbuckle the heavy leather straps of the archaic leg brace. As the thick metal contraption came away, Jackson had to bite his lip to stop from cursing out loud. The boy's right leg was heavily atrophied, the skin raw, blistered, and weeping from the constant friction of the poorly fitted brace. Bruises in various stages of healing mottled his calf and thigh. Jim, who had been pouring water from a jerry can into a metal basin, stopped and stared. "Jesus, Jax, that thing is a medieval torture device. Why would his mother put him in that?" "Because it wasn't just a brace," Leo's small voice piped up from the cot. Jackson turned. Leo was sitting up, his eyes wide and completely alert. He wasn't looking at his ruined leg. He was pointing at the heavy metal contraption resting on the floor. "Dad made it," Leo explained, his voice steady. "Before he went away, he told Mom that if the bad men ever came, she had to make sure I wore it. He said it was the only thing that could keep us safe." Jackson frowned, kneeling beside the heavy steel brace. He ran his calloused fingers over the thick metal struts and the heavy leather calf cuff. To the naked eye, it was just a crude, outdated piece of medical equipment. But Jackson was a master mechanic. He knew how things were built. He knew how his brother built things. Jackson's fingers paused on the right lateral hinge. It was unusually thick. There were no visible screws, just a smooth steel housing that looked entirely solid. "Jim, get me Cotton's toolkit," Jackson ordered. "Silas, fetch me a blowtorch." For 10 minutes, the trailer was filled with the hiss of the acetylene torch and the sharp clangs of Jackson violently working the metal. The steel housing grew cherry red, then white hot, before Jackson took a heavy ball-peen hammer and struck it with a precision born of decades working on Harley engines. With a sharp crack, a perfectly concealed false plate popped loose, clattering onto the linoleum floor. The heat hadn't penetrated the inner cavity. Resting inside a tiny nest of fire-retardant foam was a small, black object. It wasn't a USB drive. It was an encrypted, military-grade micro-hard drive, the kind used for storing massive amounts of secure data off the grid. Cotton stepped into the trailer, just as Jackson pulled the drive from the brace. The old vet's eyes widened. "Where the hell did you get that, Jax? That's NSA-level hardware. My dead brother left it for me," Jackson muttered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Cotton, can you read this?" I can crack the outer shell, Cotton said, moving toward a massive, heavily modified computer tower sitting on a folding table in the corner. If he put a secondary biometric or password on it, we might be out of luck. Cotton plugged the drive into an array of cables. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up screens of cascading green code that reflected in his wire-rimmed glasses. The trailer was dead, silent, save for the hum of the computer fans and the ragged breathing of the four men and the little boy watching the screen. Bypassing the firewall, Cotton muttered, chewing on his lower lip. He used an old phreaker code. Clever boy. Wait, no password. It's set to auto-execute upon breach. The screen suddenly went black. Then, a grainy, low-light video sprang to life. Jackson felt the breath leave his lungs. Staring back at him from the monitor, 10 years older, sporting a ragged beard and profound exhaustion in his eyes, was his brother, Arthur Miller. Jax, the digital ghost of his brother, spoke, the voice crackling through Cotton's cheap speakers. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and Sarah and the boy had to run. It means the safety protocols failed. Arthur paused on the screen, rubbing his face with a trembling hand. Jackson saw that his brother was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. I didn't steal the money, Jax, Arthur continued, his voice breaking with a sorrow that cut Jackson to his core. I didn't kill those brothers in the desert. I found something out, something sick. Big Jim stepped closer to the screen, his massive fists clenching and unclenching. It was Dutch, Arthur said, speaking the name of the Oakland chapter president with venomous hatred. Dutch has been on the Victoriano payroll for 15 years. He wasn't just letting them move guns through our territory. He was trafficking girls, kids, Jax, using our clubhouse basements as holding pens while we were out riding. A profound, horrifying silence descended upon the trailer. The Hells Angels had a zero-tolerance policy against crimes involving children. It was the one line they never crossed. I found the ledgers. Arthur's recording pressed on. I found the shipment manifests. I was going to bring it to the regional charter, but Dutch found out. He ambushed me in the desert. He slaughtered the other 3 guys to make it look like a cartel hit, and he tried to put a bullet in my head. I barely got away. I knew if I went to the club, Dutch would have me killed before I could speak. He owned the voting table. I had to disappear. I had to find a body, burn a car, and leave my life behind to protect Sarah. Arthur leaned closer to the camera, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity that mirrored the look Leo had given Jackson in the diner. Everything is on this drive, Jax. The ledgers, the bank transfers, the names of every corrupt angel on Dutch's payroll, and the locations of the cartel's holding houses. Dutch sold our brotherhood to a monster, and he used my name to cover his tracks. You have to take this to the West Coast bosses. You have to clear my name. And Jax, please, protect my boy. Protect Leo. The video abruptly cut out, replaced by a dense directory of hundreds of meticulously organized files and scanned documents. Jackson stared at the black screen. 10 years of grief, 10 years of shame, and 10 years of loyalty to a club president who was a monster in disguise violently collided in his chest. He turned slowly, looking at Silas and Jim. Silas's face was pale, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Big Jim looked like a man who had just watched his entire religion be proven a lie. Jax, Jim started, his voice barely a whisper. If this is true, Dutch is a dead man walking, but he commands 80 patched members in Oakland alone. We go against him. It's a civil war. Jackson walked over to the cot. He knelt down beside Leo, who was staring at him with his wide, icy blue eyes, Arthur's eyes. Jackson reached out and gently rested his massive hand on the boy's blonde head. Get some sleep, Leo, Jackson said softly. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. Jackson stood up, the protective uncle vanishing, replaced entirely by the sergeant-at-arms. He looked at the 3 men in the room, his eyes dark, hard, and utterly devoid of mercy. Jim, start pulling weapons from Cotton's armory. Silas, get on the burner phone. Call the presidents of the Nomad charters. Tell them I have proof that the Oakland table is poisoned. Jackson walked over to the desk and pulled the microdrive from the computer, clutching it tightly in his fist. We aren't just going to clear my brother's name. We're going to Oakland, and we are going to kill Dutch Higgins. The desert night stretched on, a vast and indifferent ocean of darkness outside Cotton's fortified compound. Inside the cramped, electronics-filled trailer, the atmosphere was thick with the ozone smell of old computer fans and the metallic tang of impending war. Jackson Miller sat at the center of it all, a man utterly transformed. The exhausted, weary biker who had been nursing a coffee at Rusty's diner was gone. In his place sat the sergeant-at-arms, a tactical predator awakened by a decade of misplaced guilt and fresh, unadulterated rage. Silas stood by the small, grease-stained window, clutching a heavy, encrypted burner phone to his ear. He had been making calls for 2 hours, reaching out to the shadows of the Hells Angels underworld. They weren't calling the established charters. Dutch had his poisonous roots too deep in the bureaucratic structure of the West Coast. Instead, they were calling the nomads. The nomads were the ghosts of the club, men who held no fixed territory, answered only to the purest interpretation of the MC's bylaws, and possessed an absolute, violent intolerance for traitors. "Iron Mike is moving," Silas finally announced, snapping the flip phone shut. He looked at Jackson, a grim satisfaction settling over his sharp features. "He's got 20 riders coming up from the border. They've seen the manifest Arthur encoded on the drive." Mike said the bylaws are clear. Dutch Higgins is a dead man, and the Oakland table is open for a purge. Big Jim grunted, racking the slide on a heavily modified AR-15 he had pulled from Cotton's hidden floor armory. The old Vietnam veteran hadn't just provided them shelter. He had provided a war chest. Rifles, tactical plate carriers, breaching charges, and crates of ammunition now covered every available surface of the trailer. 20 nomads and us 3 against Dutch's 80 patched members in Oakland, Jim muttered, checking the magazine feed on the rifle. "It's a suicide run, Jax. Even with the proof, Dutch's loyalists won't just lay down their arms." "They won't have to," Jackson replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stood up, strapping a Kevlar vest over his faded black t-shirt, carefully ensuring the screaming eagle tattoo on his neck remained visible. "We aren't attacking the clubhouse in a frontal assault. Dutch is arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. We cut the head off the snake in his own sanctuary, and the body will die." Jackson walked over to the corner of the room where Leo was sitting on the canvas cot. The boy had finally stopped shivering. He was wearing a shirt that was 3 sizes too big, provided by Cotton, and was watching the men prepare for violence with an unsettling, silent understanding. Jackson knelt, bringing himself down to eye level with his nephew. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy, tarnished Zippo lighter with the AM engraving. He pressed it gently into Leo's small, dirt-stained hand. "I need you to hold on to this for me, Leo," Jackson said softly. "You stay here with Cotton. He's a crazy old badger, but there isn't an army on Earth that could get onto this property without him blowing them to kingdom come." Leo curled his fingers around the silver lighter. "Are you going to find my mom?" "I'm going to find your mom," Jackson promised, the weight of the vow anchoring him. "And I'm going to make the men who hurt your family pay. All of them." "Jackson," Cotton interrupted, stepping out from the narrow hallway of the trailer. The old man was holding a faded blueprint rolled up under his arm. "If you're going into the Oakland clubhouse, you can't go through the front doors. Dutch installed reinforced steel and cameras 3 years ago, but he forgot about the old Prohibition tunnels beneath the East Bay, the ones your brother Arthur mapped out when you boys were prospects." Jackson's eyes widened slightly. "The Rum Runner tunnels. They connect to the basement of the clubhouse. Dutch boarded those up." "Boarded up isn't cemented in," Cotton said with a raspy chuckle, unfurling the blueprints on the table. "You take a shaped C4 charge to the secondary bulkhead. You're inside the basement before the security cameras even register a vibration. You come up through the floorboards right into the president's private meeting room." Jackson traced the blue lines on the paper, a cold, predatory smile touching his lips. It was poetic. Arthur had mapped those tunnels, and now those same tunnels would deliver his vengeance. "Load the Suburban," Jackson commanded. "We meet the nomads outside San Jose at dawn. Tomorrow night, we clean our house." The rain in Oakland fell in heavy, relentless sheets, slicking the asphalt and turning the neon lights of the industrial district into a blurred, bloody smear. The Hells Angels clubhouse stood at the end of a dead-end street, a fortress of brick, razor wire, and roaring engines. Outside, the prospects stood guard under the awnings, shivering in the coastal chill, entirely unaware of the ghosts moving beneath their feet. Deep underground, in the rotting, rat-infested brick tunnels of the old Prohibition routes, Jackson waded through ankle-deep, stagnant water. The air was suffocating, smelling of mildew and century-old decay. Behind him moved Silas, Big Jim, and Iron Mike, a towering behemoth of a man whose face was covered in tribal ink, leading a highly trained hit squad of nomads. They moved with absolute, disciplined silence. These weren't drunken brawlers. This was a surgical strike team executing a club sanction. Jackson stopped, raising a clenched fist. He stared at a heavily reinforced brick and timber wall. This was the bulkhead. Directly above them was the president's room, where Dutch Higgins held court every Thursday night. Silas moved forward, pressing a block of C4 explosive against the rotting timber, wiring the detonator with practiced, terrifying efficiency. He looked back at Jackson and gave a sharp nod. Jackson drew his .45. checking the chamber one last time. For Arthur, he whispered. For the club, Iron Mike echoed darkly. Silas hit the detonator. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. The brick wall evaporated into a cloud of pulverized dust and splintered wood. Before the debris could even settle, Jackson was moving through the breach, navigating the steep, narrow wooden stairs that led into the clubhouse basement. The heavy trapdoor at the top of the stairs was blown off its hinges. Jackson surged upward, stepping into the dim, cigar smoke-filled air of Dutch Higgins' private sanctuary. Dutch Higgins was sitting at the head of a massive oak table, flanked by 4 of his most loyal enforcers. Dutch was an older man, his hair slicked back into a silver ponytail, wearing a bespoke leather cut that looked too clean to have ever seen the road. He was mid-sentence, a glass of expensive scotch halfway to his mouth, when Jackson Miller rose from the floorboards like a demon from hell. What the one of the enforcers shouted, reaching for the pistol on his hip. He didn't make it. Big Jim came up behind Jackson, his sawed-off shotgun roaring in the confined space. The enforcer was thrown backward against the mahogany paneling, sliding down in a bloody heap. The room erupted into chaos. Iron Mike and his nomads swarmed up from the basement, their suppressed automatic weapons leveling the playing field in seconds. The remaining 3 enforcers raised their hands, dropping their weapons as the laser sights of a dozen rifles painted their chests. Dutch Higgins sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his scotch glass shattering on the floor. He stared at the giant sergeant-at-arms, his face draining of color. "Jax," Dutch stammered, recovering a fraction of his composure. "What the hell is this? This is treason. I'll have your patch stripped and your throat cut." "My patch isn't yours to take, Dutch," Jackson said, his voice echoing off the walls, heavy with absolute authority. He stepped forward, grabbing Dutch by the throat and slamming him violently against the back of his chair. Jackson reached into his pocket and slammed a heavy stack of printed papers onto the oak table, the ledgers from the microdrive, the bank transfers, the holding house locations, Victoriano cartel. Jackson hissed, his face inches from Dutch's. "You sold the club's soul. You let them use our basements for trafficking. And you murdered 3 of our brothers in the desert and blamed it on Arthur to cover your tracks." The captive enforcers looked at the papers, then at Dutch. The absolute loyalty in their eyes began to fracture. In the biker world, stealing money was a sin. Harming children and selling out the brotherhood to a cartel was a death sentence. Dutch laughed. It was a wet, desperate sound. He looked at the printed papers, then up at Jackson's furious eyes. The old president realized the game was over, but the venom in his heart refused to let him die quietly. "You think you're a hero, Jax?" Dutch spat, blood speckling his lips. "You think you're avenging your golden boy brother? You're too late." Jackson pressed his thumb into Dutch's windpipe. "Where is Sarah? Where is Leo's mother?" Dutch wheezed, a cruel, jagged smile breaking across his face. "Sarah? The cartel took her to leverage Arthur. You see, Jax, your brother didn't burn in that Cadillac 10 years ago. He's been a ghost, hunting my operations, trying to break my deal with Victoriano. They finally caught him. They tracked his wife, grabbed her, and Arthur surrendered to save her." Jackson's heart stopped. The world around him seemed to tilt. Arthur wasn't just a recording on a drive. "He's alive?" Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. "Barely," Dutch choked out, relishing the pain in Jackson's eyes. "Victoriano's men have been peeling his skin off in a shipping container at the port of Oakland for 3 days, trying to find out where he hid the master drive. The woman is there too, but by the time you reach Pier 40, they'll both be meat." Jackson didn't say another word. He didn't ask for a club vote. He simply raised his .45 caliber pistol, pressed the barrel directly against the center of Dutch Higgins' forehead, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, ending a decade of corruption in a split second. Jackson turned his back on the dead president, looking at Iron Mike. "Clean up this clubhouse," Jackson ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Take the enforcers to the desert. The Oakland chapter belongs to the nomads now." Jackson looked at Silas and Big Jim. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a frantic, adrenaline-fueled desperation. "Pier 40, Jackson said. "We're going to get my brother." The port of Oakland at midnight was a sprawling industrial labyrinth of towering metal cranes and endless rows of corrugated shipping containers. The rain was coming down harder now, a torrential downpour that washed the blood from Jackson's hands but couldn't cool the fire in his veins. The stolen cartel Suburban tore through the chain-link gates of Pier 40, shattering the lock and alerting the guards immediately. But Jackson didn't care about stealth anymore. They had the element of speed and absolute, unhinged violence. "Container section, G, blue stacks." Silas yelled from the passenger seat, navigating via the GPS coordinates Dutch had kept hidden in his desk. which they had ripped out before fleeing the clubhouse. As they rounded a massive stack of red containers, the headlights of the Suburban illuminated their target. A clearing in the maze was lit by harsh halogen work lights. 3 black SUVs were parked in a defensive circle around a rusted blue shipping container. Half a dozen heavily armed cartel sicarios wearing tactical gear were patrolling the perimeter. "Brace!" Jackson roared, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The heavy Suburban didn't slow down. It slammed head-on into the nearest cartel vehicle, a horrific crunch of twisting metal and shattering glass echoing over the docks. The airbags deployed with a violent snap, filling the cab with white powder. But Jackson was already moving, slicing the bag with his combat knife and kicking his door open. Big Jim erupted from the back seat, ignoring the rain and the incoming fire. He didn't bother aiming the shotgun. He simply laid down a wall of devastating buckshot that tore through the engine block of a cartel truck and ripped 2 sicarios off their feet. Silas was out on the right flank, his pistol barking in rapid, precise double taps. The cartel mercenaries were highly trained, but they were not prepared for the suicidal ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. Jackson moved like a machine. Bullets sparked off the wet asphalt and the metal containers around him, whizzing past his ears. He ignored them. His eyes were locked on the heavy steel doors of the blue container. A mercenary stepped into his path, raising an assault rifle. Jackson didn't break stride. He fired twice into the man's chest, stepped over his falling body, and slammed his shoulder against the locking bar of the container doors. "Jim, Silas, cover!" Jackson yelled over the deafening roar of the gunfight. With a brutal heave, Jackson threw the heavy metal doors open. The smell inside hit him instantly, a metallic, coppery stench of blood, sweat, and terror. Inside the dimly lit container, a woman was chained to a metal chair in the corner. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes were wild and fierce. This was Sarah. But Jackson's gaze bypassed her entirely, locking onto the figure suspended by heavy chains in the center of the room. The man was stripped to the waist, his torso a horrific canvas of lacerations, burns, and deep purple bruising. His head hung low, his blonde hair matted with dark, dried blood. He looked like a corpse left out for the vultures. "Arthur," Jackson breathed, the pistol trembling in his hand. At the sound of his name, the broken figure slowly, agonizingly lifted his head. The face was ruined, an eye swollen completely shut, but the one icy blue eye that remained open, the exact same shade as Leo's, locked onto Jackson. Through the blood and the agony, a weak, broken smile touched Arthur's cracked lips. "Took you long enough, big brother," Arthur rasped, his voice a ghost of the man he used to be. Jackson lunged forward, using his bolt cutters from his tactical rig to snap the heavy chains suspending his brother. Arthur collapsed, but Jackson caught him, taking his brother's full weight against his own chest. "I got you, Artie. I got you," Jackson repeated, the words tumbling out in a frantic prayer. He looked over his shoulder. Silas had rushed in and was cutting Sarah free. She didn't scream or cry. She immediately scrambled toward Arthur, her hands hovering over his wounds as if afraid to touch him. "Is Leo?" Arthur choked out, gripping Jackson's leather cut with bloody, broken fingers. "He's safe. He has the lighter. He's with Cotton," Jackson promised, tears finally mixing with the rain on his face. "He's a brave kid, Artie, just like his old man." Outside, the gunfire ceased. The heavy, booming silence of the docks returned, broken only by the sound of the pouring rain and Jim's heavy boots stepping into the container. "Perimeter is clear, Jax," Jim said softly, looking at the broken family on the floor. "We need to move before the police respond to the noise." Jackson nodded, carefully hoisting his brother over his shoulder. Arthur was impossibly light, a skeletal shadow of the biker he had once been. Silas supported Sarah, wrapping his own dry jacket around her shivering shoulders. They walked out of the steel tomb and into the pouring rain. The cartel was broken. Dutch Higgins was dead. The corrupt empire that had hunted this family for a decade was dismantled in a single night of fire and lead. Jackson placed Arthur gently into the back seat of a surviving cartel SUV. As he closed the door, he looked out over the dark waters of the bay. He had spent his whole life riding for a patch, believing that the club was the only family that mattered. But as he looked at the blood on his hands, the blood shed to protect a 7-year-old boy and a brother who had sacrificed everything, Jackson finally understood what true brotherhood meant. 3 months later, the California sun beat down on a pristine stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. The roaring, thunderous rumble of a heavily modified Harley-Davidson cut through the salty air. Jackson Miller gripped the handlebars, the wind whipping past the screaming eagle tattoo on his neck. Riding in the customized sidecar beside him, laughing as the wind caught his blonde hair, was Leo. The heavy, archaic metal brace was gone, replaced by a state-of-the-art prosthetic that Arthur had designed from his hospital bed. Farther back, riding a classic Indian motorcycle, Arthur Miller rode beside his wife, Sarah, the wind beginning to heal the scars of a decade-long nightmare. They were nomads now, bound by no territory, answering only to each other. Jackson looked at his nephew in the sidecar and smiled. The ghosts of the past were finally buried. They weren't just bikers running from the dark anymore. They were a family, chasing the endless, unbroken horizon.